What's up, guys? I'm nobody special, and I'm very lucky today. I have Joe Brown from Heresy Financial with me here today. Joe, how you doing?
Pretty good, man, and you're special in my book.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Now, Joe, earlier today, I put out a video about Janet Yellen's trip to Japan right now. And I'm going to bring up some headlines here real quick that we can look at. US and Japan agree to tackle currency, economic impact of the Ukraine war. She's meeting with the Japanese finance minister. She's also meeting with Bank of Japan governors. And the premise of my video earlier today was all about how I think Yellen is trying to avoid some kind of a mass dumping of US Treasuries because Japan, a lot of people don't realize this, Japan is the largest foreign holder of US Treasuries. They have $1.3 trillion of US debt. Right now, with the Federal Reserve unwinding their balance sheet with the raising of interest rates, our borrowing costs are going up. And if we were to add Japan to that mix, also dumping US Treasuries, could cause an uncontrolled spike in our borrowing costs. And I suspect that has a lot to do with what Yellen is doing in Japan. And I didn't really know where this might be going because this is where my understanding falls short of the interconnectivity of central banks and how the mechanics of this works. And you have a gift for putting these kind of things in terms that the layman can understand. So I wanted to bring you in and get your take on what's going on in Japan right now.
Sure thing. Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Yeah, so like you said, Japan definitely has the largest holding of treasuries compared to anybody else outside of the Federal Reserve. And the reason why Japan is a big deal, I mean, we look all around the world right now, and all around the world, there's like a dollar crisis right now. Dollars are getting more and more expensive by the day. It's causing inflation and lack of being able to purchase basic necessities for countries all around the world. We're seeing rebellions, riots, revolutions in Sri Lanka, Albania, Argentina, like literally everywhere around the world. But a lot of people, especially in the West, don't look at that as like a big deal. They're like, hey, it's just some, backwater nations that I don't even really know how to pronounce the name of the nation. And, it's just, normal stuff during hard economic times. But Japan is a different story. Japan is, historically, they've been the largest buyer of US Treasuries. In fact, like you go back decades, and every time the United States is in trouble, Japan helps bail out the United States, especially like in the Great Financial Crisis. They purchased a ton of treasuries because the United States had to issue a bunch of new debt to spend a massive deficit. And so the Bank of Japan helped us out there. So that's a big shift right now. You have up a couple of charts. If we look at let's look at the 10-year there.
This
Actually,
is
no, let's look at the yen.
here. Here is the yen.
Okay. So right now, what we're seeing is something that hasn't happened for a long time in Japan, where their currency is starting to get devalued. So their currency is losing purchasing power. And this is a big deal right now because they're trying to engage in yield curve control. So let's flip back to that other chart you have of their 10-year. And so this is they try and keep the interest rate, the yield on their 10-year government bond in a really tight range. And so when this is like, I always use the example of like an iPhone. What would happen if tomorrow Apple came out and said, we will buy all used iPhones at $2,000 a piece? Pretty much everybody would find an old iPhone to go sell to Apple for $2,000. Why is that? Because they're buying it for more than it's worth. And so when you put an artificial price floor underneath something, it doesn't stop the selling, it causes more selling because anybody who has it realizes I can sell it for more than it's worth because somebody's willing to buy it in an unlimited quantity for more than it's worth. So now I don't have to worry if I have, let's say, 10,000 old used iPhones in a warehouse. I don't have to worry about dumping them all on the market and suppressing the price of used iPhones because Apple has guaranteed they're going to buy as many as possible, as many as they want, as many as there are at $2,000 a pop. That's what's going on here. You've got the Bank of Japan saying, hey, we'll buy 10-year treasuries at a specific price to keep the interest rate pegged, regardless of how many are sold. That doesn't stop the selling. That causes more selling. And so you can see there those spikes towards the end of June. That was the couple times where where they lost control and too many bonds hit the market and they couldn't buy them all up as fast, and it caused the interest rate to temporarily spike. Now, obviously, they brought it back under control. They were able to absorb it, bring that interest rate back down, but the problem is still persisting. And the reason why they're having trouble with it is because basically they have to create new yen in order to do that. And so when they're dealing with these problems, the last thing they want to deal with is buying US Treasuries, right? Because go back to the yen versus the dollar. If they want to get Treasuries, look at how many more yen it will take than it used to, even back in, at the end of 2021. It will take a lot more yen to purchase treasuries. That's the last thing they want to do right now, is to devalue their own currency even further when they're dealing with their own issues. So now the question is, well, how long can this persist? Because right now they're sitting on, you have the chart from the balance of their treasury stockpile. They're sitting on, what is that, 1.3 trillion?
1.3 trillion, largest foreign holder of U.S. debt outside.
So
outside of the
yeah,
state. Yeah.
yeah. So at the end of the day, if push comes to shove and they need to put some upward pressure on their own currency to help out their issues, they can sell some treasuries. So we've got Yellen meeting with Japan right now, and they're talking about things that are not necessarily public. So the question is, what are they talking about? Is Japan getting ready to dump treasuries? Now, you were explaining your thoughts on this in terms of Janet Yellen's fear.
So yeah, my fear was, let me bring my chart back up. Right here is the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. 10-year Treasury yield. Right, obviously this thing has been running since the start of the year. The Fed has been hiking. The Fed is engaged in quantitative tightening. Right, all things that put upward pressure on interest rates. And Janet Yellen, the head of the Treasury, she's in charge of borrowing for the U.S. government, and the U.S. government's borrowing cost is going up. So if we ever had a disorderly unwinding of that 1.3 trillion in Japanese held US Treasuries, the effect on this chart would be to send it much higher. And I think Janet Yellen, or at least my theory is that she's trying to avoid that or somehow minimize the impact, because that would create a liquidity squeeze in our bond market, which could lead to a financial crisis. We're already struggling with these increased bond borrowing costs. You just did a video on your channel not too long ago that the wave of layoffs is finally here, that it's going to get worse. We're starting to see things about cars getting repossessed. There's obviously effects on the housing market.
Mm-hmm.
At least it's just starting.
Yeah.
So what might Yellen be worried about right now, and what might be the answer?
Yeah. So this is where my opinion tends to get me a lot of really negative feedback. But people were talking about a housing crisis in 2001. It took years for that to even become like a major concern to most contrarians, let alone be understood by the vast majority of people. So things like this can take a lot longer than people who are paying attention would expect. So I'm going to point out some things that would potentially make something like this take a lot longer to have major problems than people might expect. Number one, we have the federal government's interest expense right now is about $650 billion a year. So of all the money that they have, all the things that they have to spend money on, they're only spending about $650 billion a year on interest. As a percent of GDP, it's nowhere near the top of what it's been over the last 30 years. We've seen over the last 20 years, we've seen it as high as, I think, 3.1 or 3.2% of GDP. But you also have to take into account tax revenues, because tax revenue is not always the same percent of GDP, because the tax rate matters, incomes matter, capital gains matter, like the economic activity, all of that matters in terms of how much money the government is getting. And in May, I believe it was May, the government had a massive surplus, like an insane surplus. They brought in the largest tax revenue by like double in all of American history. And so they are not running these massive deficits that everybody likes to point out, saying, "Oh, the left, the Democrats, Biden administration, they're running these massive deficits, spending a ton of money." There's been political gridlock since the day he got in office. There has not been a lot of spending underneath the Biden administration, and we're seeing, now last month or 2 months ago, the first surplus in a long time, and it was a huge surplus. And so one of the things that would cause trouble with the United States borrowing costs going up is if they have to keep on borrowing a ton of extra money. But if their deficits are shrinking, which they are, that means the amount of money they're bringing in from taxes, which is a lot closer to the amount of money they're spending, which means they're not borrowing as much. And so if treasury yields tomorrow go up to 10%, it does absolutely zero to the government budget right now. In fact, even if they go up to 10% and they stay there, it will take years for that to catch up to the government budget because you're just rolling over the existing debt. And so I use like a credit card example where if you've got $10,000 credit card limit, you're maxed out and you're on a 12-month 0% introductory period. At the end of that 12 months, you're going to be screwed, right? You're maxed out. You can barely afford your payments. So what do? You go open up a new credit card. You do a balance transfer. You get a new loan from a new lender, pay off the old lender, and now you've got another 12 months of 0% interest. That's what the federal government does. When their debt comes due, when it matures, they pay it off by taking out a new loan from somebody else. And every time they do that, their borrowing costs go up a little bit right now. Over the last 30 years, 40 years, their borrowing costs have been decreasing when they do that. Now, interest rates are going up. So now their borrowing costs will increase as they do that. But it takes time for this to happen. I mean, even though the majority of their debt is short-term debt, like under 10 years, it'd probably still take 2 to 3 years before that those interest expenses get anywhere that's too painful or dangerous for them, especially when you take into account the income side of the equation. As they spend more, deficit spending into the economy, and prices go up as a result, well, that increases the income side for them, because even if tax rates don't change, tax revenues go up because prices are higher. People are paying more in dollar terms on their taxes because their incomes went up. Their asset prices went up. They sold them. They've got capital gains taxes. So all of this extra money that the government's spending into the economy, a lot of it comes back to them in the form of taxes. So even if interest rates continue to go up a lot from here, it will still be years before the interest expense gets to a point where it's dangerous for the United States government. So the Bank of Japan could start selling a lot of debt, and at least for a year, 2 years, wouldn't do anything to the government's ability to pay their bills. Now, you also have to take into account the reverse repo facility at the Federal Reserve. And I don't know if you have this chart up. You might be able to pull it up while I'm talking about it here. But the reverse repo facility is where a lot of the cash is currently sitting that was printed during 2020 and 2021. A lot of that cash entered the economy, and banks needed somewhere to get their collateral. And if they would have purchased short-term debt like bills, T-bills, it would have pushed the yield curve negative. That's $2 trillion. So what the Federal Reserve did was they said, hey, give that to us. We'll give you the collateral that you need for any amount of money that you put in the reverse repo facility with us, and we'll pay you 0.05% higher than the federal funds rate to sit in here. This is the only risk-free place to park your money. So money market funds, cash, banks, they're putting their money in here to get the collateral that they need, and they're making a 0.05% higher than the federal funds rate while it sits in there. So what that means is that at any point, what the Federal Reserve can do is drop the reverse repo facility interest rate, the yield that they're paying in there, and all that money floods back out. It has to find collateral. And so now if it doesn't pay as much in there, now it makes that risk to reward ratio worth it to go out into the open market and take on that a little bit additional risk to buy T-bills, buy short-term government debt. So you've got $2 trillion waiting in the back room that very few people are paying attention to. And at any point, the Federal Reserve can force that $2 trillion back out into the market. That will uninvert the yield curve because it all goes and buys short term debt. It will provide new financing for the federal government to be able to continue issuing debt at lower interest rates, even while other people are selling. This forces $2 trillion out into the market to go buy. They can continue to tighten. They can continue to raise the federal funds rate. They can continue to sell assets off their balance sheet. And they've got a $2 trillion runway here. And $2 trillion is a lot. I mean, that was the entire deficit. $3 trillion was the entire deficit in 2020, and then 2 point something was the entire deficit in 2021. And so $2 trillion is a lot of money that if that gets absorbed into the market, that gives quite a bit of runway, potentially a year or 2 years, depending on the size of the deficit. So there are a lot of things in play here that can make this look a lot less severe and take a lot longer for the consequences to come about. Ultimately, it's still like a kicking the can down the road type of thing. But if the Bank of Japan decides to sell all $1.7 trillion or $1.3 trillion of their treasuries tomorrow, it would be disorderly for a time, and the Fed would move to compensate and in coordination with Janet Yellen, and it would be absorbed, and it would take a little bit longer for it to cause like global contagion.
Okay. So no immediate effect on the government's borrowing costs because of everything you described with inflation giving the government a raise to increase tax revenue. And the reverse repo is that cushion that they could at any point redeploy into the economy just by tweaking rates. And that could offset the Japanese dumping of the treasuries. Is there anything else that Janet Yellen, she kind of blurs the line, right, between the treasury and the Fed with her background. Is
Mhm.
there anything else that the Fed might be doing or could do, some other card that they could call in that might dissuade the Japanese from selling that debt?
Yes, potentially. I mean, who knows what secret deals are being struck behind the scenes? And I would actually be shocked if we do see the Bank of Japan start to aggressively sell treasuries. And so there's certainly some things that they can do behind the scenes, some little handshake deals. You've mentioned special purpose vehicles at the Treasury; those are very hidden from public visibility. There's swap lines at the Federal Reserve that they can try and use, and so there are a number of things that they can do in order to blunt the impact or to help out the Bank of Japan here. Um, and the real risk, in my opinion, would be if they, for some reason, are looking very forward into the future and saying, "Hey, it's only a matter of time before the dollar loses reserve currency status. We want to be on the right side of history. We're in the East. We're scared about the rise of China," and they just say, "We're flipping." They start to dump, and it sparks everybody starting to dump. Then we'll see we'll see an immediate reversal in monetary policy, and the Fed will have to absorb all of the treasuries that are being sold. QE will resume, and so you'll see the Federal Reserve's balance sheet go from like almost 9 trillion right now to probably 25 trillion, maybe 30
Wow.
trillion, somewhere around there, as it absorbs. If everybody, because if one person starts selling, that pushes the prices down, that forces losses and causes everybody else to start to try and sell. And the very fact that the Federal Reserve would have to step in to absorb that selling pressure means, again, like we talked about in the beginning, what happens to iPhones if Apple buys them at 2,000? They're buying them above price. That means everybody sells them because everybody sees I can sell it for more than it's worth. If the Fed steps in, prints money to buy the treasuries, well, then everybody can sell them for more than they're worth. So it provides incentive to sell, not incentive to keep them. And so it sparks a global sell off of treasuries. Again, I don't think that's happening now. I think it's inevitable that happens at some point in the future. But it's possible that something like this, something like Japan, could spark that.
And we are starting to see at least a movement in that direction with the BRICS countries talking about the oil trade happening outside of the dollar. India just made an announcement that they're going to do a lot of their exports denominated in rupees versus the dollar. So Japan
Yes,
dumping those treasuries. That's all those dollars, all that inflation that we've exported over the years coming home to roost here in the States because the money's going to go where it has utility, right? And this is
exactly.
where it's all heading.
Yep. Yeah. 100%.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy. Folks, I'm going to put a link down in the description below to Joe's channel, Heresy Financial. I highly recommend that. It's one of my favorite finance YouTube channels that's out there. And any final
Thank you.
words, Joe?
No, that's it. I love your show and keep it up. And let's talk about this if the Bank of Japan does start selling them, then we'll do a part two.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks again, Joe, and everyone. Until next time, live small and dream big.